you're someone who loves connecting the dots, synthesizing complex ideas and having those sudden, mind-expanding aha moments without drowning, an information overload, well, you are in exactly the right place.
Absolutely.
Welcome to our book review. Today we are taking a journey into the architecture of the human mind itself, but we are doing it through some dry neuroscience textbook.
No, thankfully not.
Right? Instead, we are tackling excerpts from a genuinely fascinating landmark book called Myth and Meaning. It's subtitled Cracking the Code of Culture by the legendary French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss.
So our mission today is to strip away the dense academic jargon and uncover how human beings actually think. We are going to explore the hidden mathematical codes buried inside ancient myths.
We're going to see how our brains are literally hardwired from birth for binary logic and discover why. The so-called civilized mind might actually be missing out on quite a few things when compared to our ancient ancestors.
It is a remarkably ambitious mission, to say the least, but Levi-Strauss is arguably the single best guide we could have for this kind of intellectual excavation.
For sure.
Humans inherently love to split things into twos. We constantly categorize the world into good and evil, light and dark, nature and culture.
Right? The duality of the man.
Exactly. On one hand, you have the cold, calculating, intensely cerebral scientist who wants to map human culture like a mathematical equation. But on the other hand, you have this passionate, lyrical, highly subjective poet who is deeply moved by the stories he studies. He kind of embodies the very dualities he spent his entire life trying to decode.
That duality makes him such an intriguing figure to follow. And just to give you a sense of, just how famous and culturally ubiquitous this guy became, there's a fantastic anecdote from the foreword.
Oh, the restaurant story. I love this one.
It's so good. So once upon a time, Levi-Strauss was visiting a popular restaurant in Berkeley, CA, right? There's a long line out the door. So the hostess asked for his name to put him on the waiting list, and when he told her his name, her eyes went wide with sudden recognition and admiration. And she asked, "Oh, wow. The anthropologist or the genes?"
The anthropologist or the genes. It's just perfect.
It is the perfect encapsulation of his level of fame, right?
Yeah.
Blending supreme academic prestige with everyday pop culture.
Yeah. And it immediately humanizes a figure who, frankly, can often seem intimidatingly intellectual to approach. Definitely. And that human element is actually a great place for us to start unpacking his theories, because his approach to his own creative and analytical work is surprisingly humble. It's almost to the point of self-effacement.
Humble is almost an understatement. When you read his introduction, there's this wild, striking confession he makes early on about his own writing process. He says that he doesn't actually feel like he writes his books. Instead, he feels his books are thought through him.
Right, like he's a conduit.
Exactly. He describes his own mind. It's just a passive crossroads where ideas happen to meet and interact. The exact quote is something along the lines of, "I never had and still do not have the perception of feeling my personal identity."
Wow.
Right. He views himself merely as the intersection where the traffic of ideas collides.
And that concept of the mind as a crossroads, it's a powerful recurring metaphor for his entire philosophy.
Yeah.
He isn't necessarily claiming that every single artist or scientist creates this way, but it highlights his foundational belief that stories, ideas, and especially myths have a life and a structure of their own.
They use us, yes.
They use us as vessels to propagate themselves. The myth isn't something a person just invents out of thin air. The myth operates through the person.
Okay, let's unpack this, specifically this idea of how myths operate and sustain themselves. Levi-Strauss Trials introduces a foundational concept to explain this, and he calls the mytheme.
Mythemes.
Yeah. And to understand this, think about how language works. In linguistics, we have phonemes. A phoneme is an atomic basic sound, like the C, the A, and the T sounds in the word cat. On their own, those individual sounds mean absolutely nothing, but when you combine them in a specific structure, they create meaning. Levi-Strauss argues that myths do the exact same thing. They have atomic story building blocks, and he calls them mythemes.
That linguistic analogy is vital because myth themes are the raw structural materials of all world mythology. They are the recurring characters, the specific plot devices, the foundational conflicts. But the real question is, what happens to these materials over centuries of human history? What does that they get recycled? Myths, like any tool that is in constant use by a society, break down over time. Parts get lost, new pieces are found, and the whole thing has to be reassembled. And the person who finds these broken cultural pieces and fixes them is what Levi-Strauss famously calls a bricoleur.
A bricoleur. So if we translate that, it essentially means a handyman or a tinkerer.
Right? Precisely. Or what the English used to call a rag and bones man. Oh, I like that. Yeah, the myth maker is a conceptual handyman. They don't have access to a pristine factory of new ideas. Instead, they constantly recycle these existing mythemes, falling from what the poet William Butler Yeats called the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And they use whatever scraps are available to build entirely new stories that serve the current moment.
But okay, if they are just throwing together scraps, why do these stories always seem to take the exact same shape? Like, if you look at myths from totally isolated, unconnected parts of the world, they always seem to boil down to these massive, unyielding dualisms, right? It's always life versus death, male versus female, earth versus sky. Why are we so obsessed with opposites?
To answer that, we have to look past culture and examine the physical brain itself.
Okay.
Why do we think in dualisms? Because our physical hardware is fundamentally binary. We possess a brain divided into two distinct lobes. Those lobes control 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 hands, 2 legs.
We're split.
We are, at a biological level, split creatures. Consequently, we process our experience of reality like a simple digital machine. We take the infinite, overwhelming, chaotic data of nature and we divide it in half. Then we divide those halves in half again. And we keep cutting reality down until we can force the universe to give us a simple, manageable yes or no answer.
We are just desperate to find an order in the chaos, starting from the moment we were born. And there is a story from his childhood that perfectly illustrates how deeply wired this instinct was.
The bakery sign.
Yes. When Levi-Strauss was just 2 years old, long before he had actually been taught how to read, he proudly told his mother he could read the signs for the local shops.
At 2 years old.
At 2, he pointed out that the painted signs for boulanger the baker and boucher the butcher both started with the exact same visual squiggles. He recognized the invariant graphic elements of that first syllable, the boo. He didn't know the letters, but he saw the structural pattern.
What's fascinating here is that this 2-year-old's instinct to spot the pattern is the absolute core of what would eventually become the entire school of structuralism.
Really?
Yeah. Structuralism is, at its heart, the quest for the invariant. It is the obsessive search for the unchanging, hidden elements that lie beneath all the superficial, chaotic differences we see on the surface.
It's always about this structure underneath.
Exactly whether he was a toddler looking at the curves of shop signs or a world-renowned anthropologist comparing incredibly complex marriage rules across different isolated continents, his objective never changed. He was always looking for the hidden structural order.
It's amazing that he started looking for these hidden patterns at age 2, but what I find really compelling is that he didn't just apply this pattern-matching instinct to abstract human language or folklore. He wanted to see how it mapped onto hard, objective science.
He was a big fan of science.
He really was. The source notes that he was actually a devoted reader of Scientific American, absorbing it cover to cover every single month. He deeply respected the scientific method, but he points out that historically there was a massive intentional schism between hard science and the human senses.
Yeah. We have to look back to the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries to understand that split.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Thinkers like Descartes and Newton, they were trying to establish a bedrock of absolute truth. To do that, early modern science felt it had to completely divorce itself from sensory perception.
Why?
Because the things we see, the things we smell, and the things we taste were deemed delusive. They were viewed as inherently subjective and unreliable.
I see.
The prevailing thought was that the only real world was the world of quantifiable mathematical properties, things like mass and velocity, which could only be grasped by the pure intellect, completely bypassing the messy human body.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because modern science is finally, after centuries, looping back around to close that exact gap. For hundreds of years, a smell was considered totally subjective. My experience of the scent of a rose couldn't be mathematically quantified. It was just a feeling. But today, modern chemistry can step in and explain the exact objective chemical composition of a subjective smell.
Exactly.
A smell is no longer just a ghostly perception. It's a specific molecular structure.
Yeah.
The human senses aren't the enemy of objective science anymore. They become the very subject of it.
And this reintegration of the senses and hard science actually answers some of the oldest, most fiercely debated philosophical questions in human history.
Like what?
Take the concept of geometry, for instance. For centuries, philosophers argued bitterly over how we as humans know what a perfect circle or a perfectly straight line is. Okay, one faction argued for the concept of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. Thinkers like John Locke argued we are born knowing nothing, and we learn the concept of a line purely from experiencing imperfect shapes in nature over time. And the other side, the opposing side, going all the way back to Plato, argued for innate ideas, that the blueprints for perfect shapes are pre-programmed into our minds before we are even born, regardless of what we see in the physical world.
Right? The logic being, if you've never actually seen a truly mathematically perfect circle in nature, because a perfect circle doesn't naturally exist, how can you close your eyes and instantly picture one in your mind? Where did that perfect image come from?
Exactly. And modern neurobiology finally provides the answer to that riddle. And the brilliant part is that it's neither the blank slate nor the purely innate mind.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Researchers have discovered that the specific cells in our retina are actually highly specialized.
Professionalized.
How? Some visual cells will only fire when they perceive a vertical line. Other cells will only respond to a horizontal line. Yes, the foundation of geometry isn't just floating around ethereally in the mind, nor is it purely learned by bumping into things in the outside world. The geometry is built right into the physical, biological hardware of our nervous system. Our physical body acts as the crucial mediator between the abstract mind and the physical reality.
Our eyes are literally performing geometry before our conscious brain even has a chance to get involved. That is mind-blowing. And realizing how sophisticated our innate biological processing is, it completely changes how we should look at different types of human intelligence throughout history. Which brings us to a highly loaded, controversial term that Levi-Strauss specifically addresses, the word primitive.
It is a heavily charged, often derogatory term, and Levi-Strauss fundamentally rejects it as a useful or accurate descriptor for ancient or indigenous cultures. So what does he use instead?
He prefers the specific phrase people without writing. For him, the invention of a written alphabet is the true defining dividing line in how cultures process and store information. It represents a shift in technology, not some grand evolutionary leap in raw biological intelligence.
Right. And the source material highlights how he impartially but systematically takes down previous generations of anthropologists who completely misunderstood these so-called primitive cultures. First, you had Bronisław Malinowski, who was hugely influential. Malinowski believed that indigenous myths were purely utilitarian.
Right?
He basically argued that people without writing were entirely driven by the basic, urgent biological needs of survival: finding food, securing shelter, reproducing. In his view, their myths and rituals were nothing more than practical tools designed to satisfy those immediate bodily needs. They were just stomachs with legs trying to survive.
And then swinging completely in the opposite direction. You had thinkers like Lucien Lévi-Strauss. He argued that these populations were entirely driven by emotion and mystical magical thinking.
Like they were living in a fantasy world.
Exactly. He believed they lived in a perpetual dreamlike fog, completely lacking any capacity for logical rigor or scientific categorization. Levi-Strauss steps in, looks at the evidence, and says both of these dominant theories are entirely wrong. He argues that people without writing are in fact highly intellectual, and crucially, their intellectualism is deeply disinterested.
Disinterested. Now, to be clear, for anyone listening, that doesn't mean they were bored.
No, not at all.
It means they weren't just thinking about their next meal or their immediate physical safety.
Exactly. To be disinterested means they possess a genuine burning philosophical desire there to understand the universe simply for the sheer sake of understanding it.
Like scientists.
Yes, they are acting as pure philosophers and early scientists, trying to construct a cohesive, logical picture of reality that accounts for the stars, the animals, and the weather long before they worry about what's for dinner.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the exact intersection where mythical thinking and modern scientific thinking fundamentally diverge. In their methodologies, myth attempts to achieve a total understanding of the universe immediately in the realm of mythical thinking. If your story can't explain absolutely everything, from why the sun rises to why the bear has a short tail, then it hasn't explained anything. It demands a complete, unbroken, flawless narrative of reality from day one.
And we have to acknowledge that having a total explanation for the universe is incredibly psychologically comforting. But it provides only the illusion of mastery over nature.
Right? Because it's just a story.
Exactly. Science, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. Science divides difficulties. It proceeds painstakingly, step by step, focusing on tiny, highly specific, isolated problems. It refuses to give you the comforting picture of the whole universe at once. But in exchange for that patience, it gives you actual, tangible mastery over the physical world.
But, and this is a huge challenging, but for you to consider, what did we trade away in order to gain that actual technological mastery?
It's a great question.
Because we have this inherent bias to assume that modern industrialized humans are operating at absolute peak mental capacity, while ancient peoples were somehow falling short or underdeveloped. But the source drops a historical fact that absolutely floored me.
The Venus fact. Yes, ancient sailors, relying entirely on the naked eye without any telescopic aids, could navigate the oceans by seeing the planet Venus in the middle of full daylight.
It sounds utterly impossible to our modern sensibilities. And furthermore, indigenous peoples without writing maintain a fantastically precise, exhaustive, encyclopedic knowledge of every single plant, insect and animal in their local environment. They can identify subtle variations in botany that would baffle a modern biologist. They utilise a massive, intense amount of their sensory perceptions to survive, to thrive, and to map their work.
We've entirely lost that sensory sharpness. Most of us wouldn't know Venus from a commercial airplane flying overhead, and we certainly can't identify the edible or medicinal properties of every plant growing in our own neighborhoods. But we made a trade. We traded away that acute sensory capacity so we could process the complex spatial geometry required to drive a car down a crowded highway at 70 miles an hour without crashing.
Right.
We treated it to be able to seamlessly operate a smartphone or mentally filter out the constant, overwhelming barrage of digital media we face every day.
It's entirely a reallocation of mental resources. We are simply using different sectors of our mental capacity, not necessarily better or more evolved ones.
Yeah,
The human mind, biologically and functionally, is essentially the exact same mechanism everywhere across the globe and across history. It just adapts its intense focus based on the specific environmental and technological demands of the culture it currently inhabits.
which brings us to the absolute pinnacle of this book review. We were going to look at a specific myth from the source material that proves just how sophisticated, logical, and advanced this so-called savage mind really was.
This is such a great example.
It really is. So this is a story originating from the indigenous peoples of Western Canada. It's set in a mythical time, before humans and animals were truly distinct from one another, and the massive central problem driving the plot of this myth is the south wind.
The south wind is blowing fiercely, and it is blowing constantly, every single day, without a moment of pause.
Right. And because it's blowing constantly, the people can't launch their canoes to fish. They can't gather shellfish on the shore. The constant weather has created a crisis of survival. They're literally starving.
Yee.
So a crew of these mythical half-human, half-animal beings decides they have to go fight the wind to save their people. And one of the key members recruited for this heroic, impossible mission is a skate, a flatfish.
A skate.
Now, if you were hearing this for the first time, I have to ask, why on earth would the mythmaker choose a flatfish to fight the wind? It sounds completely absurd.
It absolutely sounds like pure absurdist fantasy until you look closely at the physical reality of the creature itself. This is where the brilliant bricklayer, the conceptual handyman we talked about earlier, comes in.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The mythmaker didn't choose the skate randomly out of a hat. Consider the physical traits of a skate. It is a flatfish underneath. Its skin is incredibly slippery on top. It's very rough. And physically, if you look at escape from above or directly from below, it looks massive. It presents a huge, vulnerable target.
Right? It looks like a giant kite underwater.
But if an enemy, a predator, or in the context of the myth, someone shooting an arrow, tries to attack it, the skate does something remarkable to survive.
What does it do?
It suddenly turns on its side because it is a completely flat fish. When it turns 90 degrees, it suddenly presents a razor-thin profile to the attacker. The arrow misses entirely and the fish slips away unharmed.
So in the story, the crew attacks and the skate uses this exact dodging ability to help capture the south wind. They trap the wind and they force it to negotiate for its freedom. The wind promises it won't blow every single day anymore. It agrees to a compromise. It will only blow every other day. This break in the weather allows the people to finally fish, gather food, and survive. So what does this all mean beyond just being a clever story about animal traits? Why did the mythmaker use the skate to tell the specific story about changing the weather?
This is the absolute genius of the myth. The skate is being used by the storyteller as a biological binary operator.
Whoa!
To understand the gravity of that, think about how a modern computer works. A computer, which is the peak of our civilized technology, solves incredibly complex problems using logic gates. These are switches that exist in only two absolute states: on or off, 0 or 1, yes or no. The skate, based on its physical biology, exists in two discontinuous states. It is either massively wide or it is razor thin. There's no in between. It acts as a biological yes or no switch.
It's a living, breathing logic gate. B. It is. The myth is addressing a binary problem in nature. The wind is currently blowing always, which is a single, unsustainable state. The people need to change the wind to an alternating binary schedule. Yes, it blows today. No, it doesn't blow tomorrow.
Unbelievable.
To conceptualize and solve this binary problem, the mythmaker, functioning as a brilliant conceptual programmer, grabs the perfect tool from the natural world, the skate. Long before the invention of cybernetics, long before silicon chips, microprocessors, and computer algorithms, the human mind was already utilizing advanced binary logic and successfully embedding it inside an entertaining story about a fish
that reframes everything. The so-called savage mind was quite literally writing codes using the flora and fauna around them. Is the programming language
Yak Sagar.
It completely shatters how we should look at these ancient stories. They aren't just quaint fairy tales or primitive superstitions. They are incredibly sophisticated algorithms trying to balance the harsh equations of human survival and natural order.
It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the drive to find order, to translate the terrifying chaos of the natural world into a manageable language of rules and meanings, is a universal, deeply ingrained human trait. Whether we are using animal methemes around a campfire or microchips in a server farm, the underlying cognitive process, the need to categorize and control, is exactly the same.
So let's trace the incredible journey we've taken today. We started with a 2-year-old, Claude Lévi-Strauss, recognizing the invariant visual patterns in the painted signs for a bakery in a butcher. We moved into the deep physical biology of our brains, discovering that our very retinas are physically hardwired to process geometric shapes before we even think about them. And we ended up in the ancient myths of Western Canada, watching a flat fish act as a biological computer program designed to mathematically control the weather.
It is a profound, humbling reminder that we are all at our absolute core sense, making acres. We are biologically and culturally built to find the pattern hidden inside the noise.
And I want you to remember that truth the next time you feel completely overwhelmed by the sheer chaos of modern life, when you are drowning in endless emails, the relentless 2-hour news cycle, or just the sheer terrifying volume of information we process daily.
We all feel it.
We really do. Just remember that your brain is a brilliant, highly evolved bricoleur. You're perfectly designed by thousands of years of evolution to sift through that rag and bone shop of modern data, find the invariant patterns, and build your own sturdy meaning out of all that noise.
And yet, if the human mind has always been at its foundation, a binary machine desk desperately trying to resolve paradoxes and create order through myth, this raises an important question for us today. We'll accept when we look at our own modern obsessions. Our complex algorithms, our artificial intelligence models, are incredibly immersive virtual realities. Are we actually being purely scientific, or are we simply writing a brand new, highly complex mythology using the digital scraps of our own era?
Wow. Now that is something profound to chew on as you go about your day. Thank you so much for taking this book review with us. Keep questioning the reality around you. Keep looking for those hidden patterns and the noise, and we will catch you next time.
Goodbye, and may you always be surrounded by books.